All right, let's get started. So I want to start with a story, very simple story. So I was at home a couple weeks ago. I wanted some soup, so I made one of those, microwave soup things. I brought it up to my office, put down my bowl of soup, and then, someone called, right? So I left the office and answered the call and came back into my office, and I saw my dog. His name's Robert. Saw my dog and had a very guilty expression on his face. Have you ever seen a dog like that when they sort of hang their head down and they're looking, they know something, they've done something wrong, right? You can see it. You can see it in their eyes. They're kind of not, making eye contact. So I looked over and the soup was gone. Obviously Rover the dog had slurped up all my soup when I had left the office. So my initial thought was, he could have got away with it, right? It could have been the perfect crime. He could have blamed it on, some passing cat or, why was he even looking guilty at all in that situation? So that got me thinking about Darwin, and it got me thinking about the topic for today's talk. And really the topic for today's talk is, the goal of the talk today is to argue that there's really no difference in the morality of Rover than the morality of a human. That we are really, we share with the rest of the animal kingdom a set of social instincts and a set of the same preconditions that you need for morality. And I'm going to try to explain, that's actually not my thesis, that's actually Darwin's thesis, and I want to explain his argument over the course of this talk. So let me start. I want to start by giving you a quick overview of Darwin's major works, because it'll make sense why later on. Darwin planned out things very, very carefully in the way he actually wrote his works and he published them. So everyone knows he has like four major works. His first work was The Voyage of the Beagle, right, where he talked about his expedition when he was young. That was his first book. His second book, the one he's most famous for, is The Origin of the Species. And in The Origin of the Species, that's the book where he argues that all of life can be explained through his principle of natural selection. That it all can be explained through evolution, through natural selection. But he was very careful to leave out one particular form of life from that book. And that one particular form of life was us, right? He left out everyone in the room, talked about all the other types of living animals on Earth. And he wrote to Wallace at the time that he intentionally left out man because he wanted to, quote, avoid the whole subject because it was so surrounded with prejudices, though I fully admit that is the highest and most interesting problem for the naturalist. So he knew it was an important problem. It's something that he wanted to do. It's just that, he wanted to make sure that everyone would accept his ideas about evolution by natural selection before he, took on the really hard case of man. So that was smart. So he waited 12 years. And after 12 years, that's when he tackled man in his next book called The Descent of Man. And the real argument for Descent of Man is, you know what? Everything I said in that previous book, also true for man. That's the basic argument for The Descent of Man. And as part of writing The Descent of Man, he wrote his fourth major work. His fourth major work was The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, which is, also very important to what we'll be talking about today. He wrote that book. He started to write that book as part of his research for The Descent of Man. It came up to provide supporting arguments for what he was trying to argue in The Descent of Man book. So today, I'm going to be focusing on The Descent of Man because that's where he makes his arguments about human morality. Okay. So what's the thesis? The thesis of The Descent of Man is that that man is no different from any other form of life on Earth. And to support the thesis, he looks at three possible arguments against the thesis. He looks at, number one, the argument that somehow man is different in their body from every other animal, that there's something about the constitution of the human body that makes us distinct. Then he says, well, maybe if it's not the human body, maybe the argument could be that just because of our mental powers, there's something about human minds that make us distinct from all the other animals. And then his third thing that he looks at is he wants to look at the idea that, what really makes humans unique? It's morality. That's something that, we have that special than everyone else. So you already know the end of this argument. He wants to argue that no, we're not an exception. As Darwin keeps saying over and over in the book, humans are not different in kind, although they might be different in degree from other forms of life on Earth. There's nothing truly exceptional about humans. We are just like everything else, even though we might have fancy iPhones and all of that, the same mental powers, the same moral powers, same everything that you can find in man, you can find in other animals in different degrees that roam the earth. So that's the central argument. He writes, if man had not been his own classifier, he would never have thought of founding a separate order for his own reception, right? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about his three main arguments in the book. His first argument is that the human body is not different in kind from the chimps or the gorillas or all the other, primates. And you have to understand the context when he made this argument. So his first book came out, Origin of the Species. It, of course, created this huge amount of debate because he was very careful not to say anything about man at all, and so everyone jumped in, especially Huxley, right? Darwin's bulldog. He jumped into the argument as Darwin's defender. At the same time, Wallace, one of the co-discoverers of the theory of natural selection, Wallace, who was always very spiritual, he started saying, there's separate spheres for man and for the rest of the animals, that man has this soul and all of that. So there was all this stuff going on right after he wrote his book. And part of the reason that he was finally motivated to write The Descent of Man was, some of his defenders, he started to have disagreements with those guys as well, because while they were defending his theory of natural selection, they weren't defending it for man, which of course Darwin thought was one of the most important points about his theory. So at the time, Richard Owen he's the guy who named dinosaurs dinosaurs. At the time, Richard Owen was claiming that there was one special bodily characteristic that human beings have, that no other animal has on Earth. It's this one little thing in the minor hippocampus. We have a minor hippocampus, and that little speck in the brain, well, that makes all the difference. That gives us morality, that gives us our great mental powers, that makes humans humans. And he managed to get his hands on a gorilla, which is very hard at the time, but he managed to get his hands on a gorilla, and he showed that in the brain of the gorilla there is in fact no minor hippocampus, and therefore, humans are distinctive from the rest of animals on Earth. Now, I hope even from, the presentation of Owen's argument, that's just crazy, right? I mean, everything else is the same except for this one minor speck, and that's going to be the seed of all the differences between man and everything else. But anyway, even ignoring that, it turned out he was wrong about that, and Huxley managed to show that no, there was an incipient minor hippocampus even in the gorilla's brain. And so that was called the Gorilla Wars, that argument between Huxley and Owen. So this was the context in which he wrote Descent of Man, and he refers to Huxley's arguments within his book. He also refers to a bunch of other arguments too, things like that are just inexplicable unless you assume that man descended from the same origins as chimpanzees and orangutans. Things like, we have those fish gills when we're little, we have fish lungs, we have tails, some humans are still born covered with hair. Yes, tons and tons of, crazy examples that just don't make sense if we were created as a distinct type of entity on the earth. He writes, on any other view, the similarity of pattern between the hand of a monkey or man, the foot of a horse, the flipper of a seal, the wing of a bat, etc., is utterly inexplicable, right? And I think everyone today would concede that argument. Darwin's right. There's just too many similarities between the human body and the rest of nature to explain it away from anything except for a common descent. All right, so that was his argument for there's no difference in kind between human body and the rest of animal kind. The second argument concerned the brain, right? The mind, more specifically, that humans are distinct, they're exceptional, because we have this mind and no animal has the same type of mind. I mean, I haven't seen a monkey invent an iPhone yet, so take that, rest of nature. That's what makes us so special. That's why humans are more special than the rest of life forms on Earth. What Darwin argues is, nevertheless, the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. And there again, he makes the argument, this is a rather extended argument that I won't get into. It's also something he takes up in the expression of emotions in man and animals, that actually you can find most of the mental characteristics that we talk about in man, also in animals. He spent a lot of time at the different zoos around London looking at chimpanzees and trying to show that the emotions in particular are things that we share with other animals. Darwin was very fond of dogs, just like a lot of Englishmen at the time. So he wrote at length about all this heroic activity his dog was doing all the time, which gave him evidence that, there must be that we're really mentally not that different from dogs. He writes, "It has, I think, now been shown that man and the higher animals, especially the primates, have some few instincts in common. All have the same senses, intuitions, and sensations, similar passions, affections, and emotions, even the more complex one," here we go, "such as jealousy, suspicion, emulation, gratitude, and magnanimity. They practice deceit and are revengeful, and they are sometimes susceptible to ridicule, and even have a sense of humor." Apparently, his dog had a sense of humor. I don't know about that. "They feel wonder and curiosity. They possess the same faculties of imitation, attention, deliberation, choice, memory, imagination, the association of ideas, and reason, though in very different degrees." So, of course, this would make any modern psychologist, head explode, right? We've had like 100 years of behaviorism, black box functionalism, all these different theories where the whole point is to say, well, you can't really know what's going on in these animals' heads, so let's treat them as robots. Of course, Darwin was before all of this crazy stuff. And actually, this seems much more reasonable to me. As I was saying before, when I see Rover looking guilty, I actually, believe he's feeling a certain emotion of guiltiness. And when thunder strikes at night and Rover comes leaping into our bed, shivering, I think he's, terrified by the thunder. So I'm willing to at least go part of the way here with Darwin in saying that really we're not different in kind from the other animals. They also have mental lives, and we have a lot of evidence from interacting with animals that they have mental lives. So let's just concede that over to Darwin as well. Now, the third argument that Darwin makes, and this is the one that causes the chief problem. The third argument is about morality, right? Surely morality is what makes man man, what makes us distinct in kind, not only in degree, but in kind from the rest of life on earth. He writes, "Of all the differences between man and the lower animals, the moral sense or conscience is by far the most important." And so this is the argument that he's most worried about, and that, one of the main goals for writing The Descent of Man is he wanted to show that actually, again, it's only a difference in degree and not kind that we have between all the other animals. So he, not surprisingly, argues that human morality can be explained through natural selection, right? Through natural selection. He writes, "It can hardly be disputed that the social feelings are instinctive or innate in the lower animals, and why should they not be so in man?" he asks. And then he goes on and he makes an argument that human morality is based on social instincts. That it is whenever you have a community of dolphins or a community of chimpanzees or dogs or any group of social animals together, then they will develop social instincts. In particular, he writes that in any animal whatever endowed with well-marked social instincts, the parental and filial affections here being included, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers have become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. So that's actually a central thesis right there. There are two necessary conditions for there to be morality. The two necessary conditions are, number one, you have to have social instincts, and number two, you have to be smart enough to understand sort of what those to understand the consequences of those social instincts. So sharks, no possibility of being moral, since they're not social animals. Thermostats, or even, iPhones communicating together, well, they're not smart enough to be able to have morality. So those are his two conditions. So his argument there is that the social instincts exist because they lead to greater reproductive success. And this got Darwin into a lot of trouble historically, right? Group selectionism was never particularly popular after Darwin, but Darwin's very explicit about saying that, social instincts allow tribes to do better than other tribes. And this is selection not happening at the level of an individual, it's happening at the level of the tribe that the individual is in. He writes, when two tribes of primeval man living in the same country came into competition, if other circumstances being equal, the one tribe included a great number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members who were always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other. This tribe would succeed better and conquer the other. So he's pretty explicit. You want to be part of that group over there where everyone's, sacrificing themselves for one another and being courageous and brave. Because if you're part of that tribe, you're going to win long term. Even though for any particular member, it might not be so good. For the overall tribe, it works out well in the end. He gives another example of this. This is his famous eagle example. An eagle seized a young monkey, which, by clinging to a branch, was not at once carried off. It cried loudly for assistance, upon which the other members of the troop, with much uproar, rushed to the rescue, surrounded the eagle, and pulled out so many feathers that he no longer thought of his prey, but only how to escape. This eagle assuredly would never again attack a single monkey of a troop. So in this story, you're supposed to envision this poor little monkey out there in the wild, and this eagle coming swooping in, trying to grab that monkey, and then all of his other, tribe mates, all the other monkeys come rushing in and start attacking the eagle. And the eagle, I guess eagles can remember this, the eagle knows never to attack that tribe again, because if he messes with those monkeys, he's going to get his feathers ripped out. And so that teaches, first it teaches the other monkeys that it's good to work together, because you'll keep the eagles away. So that's his basic argument. His basic argument is that social instincts lead to greater reproductive success, and it's no different from the explanation of all the rest of the characteristics of humans. Just like we have our hands and we walk upright and we don't have tails anymore. And we have morality. Same reason it results in greater reproductive success. It's part of the same explanation for everything else. Darwin's a broken record, or in other words, he's been consistent across everything. So it's not surprising that he's arguing in this way about morality. But notice that in some ways this is a shocking claim, right? And in fact, Darwin immediately compares his view of morality against a very popular view of morality at the time, utilitarianism, and he disagrees with utilitarianism. The utilitarians believe in the greatest happiness principle, right? The right action to do in any situation is the action that will produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Darwin says, no, that's wrong. He says it's not about greatest happiness, it's about greatest reproductive success. And he writes, in the case of the lower animals, it seems much more appropriate to speak of their social instincts as having been developed for the general good rather than the general happiness of the species. The term general good may be defined as the rearing of the greatest number of individuals in full vigor and health, with all their faculties perfect, under the conditions to which they are subjected. As the social instincts, both of man and the lower animals, have no doubt been developed by nearly the same steps, it would be advisable, if found practicable, to use the same definition in both cases, and to take as a standard of morality the general good or welfare of the community rather than the general happiness. So he wants to make it all about the general good instead of the general happiness. And his main argument is for that, which I think is kind of interesting, is he says, look, utilitarianism isn't even intuitive. He gives the example of a guy rushing in to save someone from a building that's burning down. He says, look, that guy's not rushing in because he thinks he'll make him happy, or he thinks it'll increase the overall happiness of the world. It's not like, wow, gee, I can go see a movie or rush in and save someone's life. He's rushing in because he thinks it's the right thing to do. That's the moral thing to do. And utilitarianism is all about, it's all focused on the greatest happiness. But he says people do plenty of things in their life, not because they think it will lead to them feeling happier. They lead, miserable lives, but they still feel like they're doing the right thing, that they're doing the good thing, and that it just doesn't match our intuitions about morality to say that we're motivated to do everything out of a need to increase happiness. We also just do things because we think it's the right thing to do. Okay, and there could be some confusions here with Darwin, willing to discuss later on. But let me move on. So the next question that naturally comes up is, for Darwin, then morality is all about your group, right? It's about building up these social instincts and defending the group. So the question arises, well, what is your group? What counts as your group and what doesn't? So I found this section really kind of shocking, what Darwin writes here. So I'm just going to read it out loud. What Darwin writes is, as man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual they ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. So in other words, we start with these social instincts being developed around the tribe, and then we start extending that out to entire nations, but it doesn't stop there. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. If indeed such men are separated from him by great differences in appearance or habits, experience unfortunately shows us how long it is before we look at them as our fellow creatures. So, this is pretty good for, 1800 slightly racist Darwin to say, hey, let's go ahead and extend out what we consider part of our group, our community, to all the people of the world, right? So now he's saying, through reason, we can extend our social instincts out beyond just Englishmen, and embrace, all nations of the earth. But he doesn't stop there. He also says sympathy beyond the confines of man, that is, humanity to the lower animals, seems to be one of the latest moral acquisitions. So Darwin, you crazy animal rights guy, again, it's kind of shocking from someone writing back in the 1800s, but now he's talking about through reason again, extending what you consider the group to be beyond just all the human nations on earth, but also into the animal kingdom. Okay. So the other implication of what Darwin is talking about, and we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the chimpanzees and the bonobos, a few weeks ago. But the other thing that Darwin makes a big deal about is the idea that morality is contingent, that we could have evolved in different ways and we would have had a different morality. He got into some trouble for this. I think this is kind of funny though, so I'm going to read it anyway. He got in trouble for writing this paragraph. If, for instance, to take an extreme case, men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it is a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. So you got a lot of angry articles after the first edition about, that particular paragraph, that, if we had grown up in the same social conditions of bees, then murder would seem, perfectly fine. But he pushed back in the second edition and by saying, the instincts of the bees have been acquired for the good of the community. So for them, that would be the right thing to do. Okay. And the other thing to understand about all of this is it's important to understand that Darwin isn't claiming that the way humans act is in every situation we try to calculate out what's the best action to take to improve our reproductive success. That's not really his argument here. That would make Genghis Khan, who by the way Genghis Khan had, he's responsible for, what do I have? I have the stat right here. 0.5% of all people on Earth descend from Genghis Khan. That would make Genghis Khan like a saint. Genghis Khan had 2,000 wives. He had an incredible amount of reproductive success. And he's responsible for a huge amount of, he's the ancestor, the huge amount of currently living people on Earth. That doesn't mean that he has reached sainthood in, Darwin's world. Darwin is all about community, right? The social instincts are community things, and it's about the greater success rate of communities. All right, so, okay, so we talked before about what the social instincts are, but I want to say a little more about them. We talked about in monkeys and also in chimpanzees. The Franz de Waal did those experiments where he put two monkeys next to one another in two different cages, and then he had taught them both the same task. And when he gave one monkey a grape, but then he gave the other monkey a cucumber for the same task, the monkey that got the cucumber took the cucumber and flung it at the experimenter, not being happy. So this is supposed to be evidence of social inequality, and it's a good example of the type of social instinct that Darwin is talking about here. I want to talk about today about another experiment that Franz de Waal did, and the interesting thing about this experiment is another example of social instincts. But when Franz de Waal did this experiment, he did it not only on chimpanzees, he also did it on human children, and it's also been replicated around the earth with different communities. I thought it would be more fun to actually try it out with you guys. This experiment, I don't know if you've heard it before, it's called the ultimatum game, and let me tell you the basic rules, and we'll have some volunteers come up and do it. Have any of you heard of the ultimatum game before? Because I'm going to exclude you immediately. Okay, Bradley, sorry. Oh, okay. Jack and Bradley are excluded. So the basic rules of the ultimatum game is you have $4, right? So I have $4 bills here. And the idea is that you have two people. You have a proposer and you have a recipient. And the idea is that the proposer can propose to divvy up the $4 however they want, and the recipient can decide to reject it. In that case, neither of them get anything. So the recipient can either decide to agree with the way that the proposer decides to divvy things up, and then they get whatever has been offered, or they can reject it all and neither of them get anything at all. So who wants to volunteer for this? Oh, Thane, you're up. Anyone else? All right, serious? All right, Ada, get up here. All right, so Thane, here's your $4. So you can propose to divvy it up with your, but remember, Ada, you have the right to reject, and then Thane won't get anything, and you also won't get anything.
Well, why can't I just do 2 for each? Before I could get more red to me too.
I'm not.
Also, can I keep this after?
Yes, you can keep it after. It makes the experiment more real.
I don't want to give it. I'm leaning towards just giving her the $1. Then.
Do you accept the proposal?
Yes!
Nice. All right. Well done. All right. So that was completely irrational. You did not maximize your money, because what you should have done.
But then she would have rejected it. I wouldn't have done anything.
Yeah, there's other.
So what you should have done is just offer $1, because from her perspective, well, at least I get $1. Versus nothing at all.
That's not her perspective.
But just to be clear, I'm proud of you, Athena, because that shows that you're actually a human being and not a, I don't know, like a crab or some sort of, weird insect. So, so what Athena did was, that is the for Western cultures, that's the action that most people do. That's on average. Most people tend to divvy up the money evenly, exactly in the way that Athena did it. That's the most common outcome for the experiment. Even though, from the perspective of what's rational, it would be rational for Athena to have kept in that situation the $3 and offer her sister $1, and then and she would have gotten, she would have come out ahead in that situation, and would have been rational for Ada to take that proposal. So it's interesting that Franz de Waal did an experiment with chimpanzees as well, and he found the same conclusion, that chimpanzees will not do the thing that maximizes their own success, that they will decide on the fair decision, on the fair outcome, rather than the one that helps the proposer in the situation. They also repeated the experiment with 3 to 5-year-olds, and they found that children 3 to 5 also tend to divvy things up evenly when doing the ultimatum game. The only exception to this is they found that depending on the social structure of different groups, that they had different outcomes. For example, among Indonesian whalers, they found that they tend to even be more generous than people on average. They tend to even give more of the money. They'll give preferential treatment to. So in their case, Athena would only keep $1 and give away $3. And the theory there is because they're so dependent on other people if you're in a whaling community that you really, really need to get along with the rest of society. So there are cultural differences in the way that the outcomes of the ultimatum game. But notice that in general, though, that this is some good evidence of this idea behind social instincts and group selectionism, that people are willing to do things that help the community over their individual success. Okay, so last thing. So what are the social instincts? We saw one of them, right? I think that's a pretty clear social instinct. I don't think that's learned. I think people innately have this inequality aversion, that's what it's called, have an inequality aversion that they're just born that way. What are the other social instincts? Well, this turns out to be a very, very hard question. And the reason it's a hard question is we still don't really understand what's going on in the mind. We don't even have a good theory of emotions right now. I actually spent several weeks going through the basic research on emotions, and it turns out that we're really in not much better shape than at the time of Darwin. Remember, Darwin devoted several years to writing The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. That actually turned into Paul Ekman, who's famous for emotions now. I don't know if any of you have read Paul Ekman. He's the Lie to Me guy. He's the television show. Well, anyway, so he actually started out by coming up with a new edition of Darwin's book on the expression of emotions, and then he extended his theory based on that. But it really hasn't gone too far beyond that, because we really still don't have a very great way of understanding what's going on, in the human mind. So we know, I think we know that there's social emotions. We just don't have a very good idea of what they are. Darwin wrote in The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals that the social instincts, he believes, grew out of parental or filial affections, because he thinks that they only develop when the young remain for a long time with their parents. So it develops out of that community instinct in the beginning. Like Hume and Adam Smith, he thinks that sympathy is a natural instinct. So he thinks that sympathy grew out of the parental instinct. And he writes that communities which include the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. And he also, in Expression of Emotions, he says sympathy appears to constitute a separate or distinct emotion. So this is very, if you read Hume or Adam Smith, this is very in line with the moral psychology of the time, that it's all based around sympathy. And that's really as far as Darwin gets in terms of explaining the social instincts. So, conclusion. So the conclusion is Darwin has one giant argument that he made throughout his life. He was very, very careful about how he crafted that argument. He started out in The Origin of the Species by claiming that all of life can be explained by his one principle of natural selection. He very carefully left out man in Origin of the Species because he knew people wouldn't accept his general principle if he included man there. So he sneakily waited 12 years after Origin of the Species and devoted a new book, The Descent of Man, just to showing Origin of Species applies to man. And then he did his best in the Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals to show that there's no difference in kind, again, between the human mind and human morality and the rest of the animal kingdom. So I really do think, I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't want to insult Rover. I really do think that Rover was very, very guilty. And he should feel guilty for eating the soup.